but it was wonderful. Just the joy of Shabbat to reinforce what we kind of already knew. But sometimes, even though you're doing what you know you should be doing, and it's not necessarily a big emotional thing anymore, because this is just what grown-ups do. Every now and then you need that reinforcement, you need that encouragement. Yes, continue in the way that you're walking. And it was so strange because the people who did have their video turned on, it was really strange. It was like they just started glowing. And that's what we're going to start with tonight, or today. It's actually earlier than I usually start. We moved over one time zone, but that's where we're going to start today. Is probably what should have been the end of last night's lesson, but I was kind of pressed for time last night to kind of wrap up this light of Shabbat and why it's so important to the nations. And then that'll take us into more of what I want to do for today. So let me share my screen with you. And this is where we ended last night, about guarding the Shabbat and the Veshamru, which is a prayer that's done on Shabbat. But when we do the Veshamru, how it reminds us that we are called. He is raising us up to repair the walls. He is raising us up to stand in the breach when for so long there was no one. And so because there was no one, he had to send his own arm to do it for himself. And so if his righteousness goes before him, his righteousness, the scripture says, also goes before us. Now, of course, his righteousness is Yeshua. It's the living word going before us. And so the scripture connected this being called to repair the breaches, to stand in the gap, to start building up the walls, to be the watchman over the vineyard and over the walls of Jerusalem. It had to do directly with Shabbat. You know, if that's, you say, what's the easy answer here? What's the simple answer I can take away from this prophecy? The simple answer was, when you keep the Shabbat, you're climbing up on the wall. When you keep Shabbat, you're walking into that breach in the wall and you're holding that place. So no more predators can go in or out of there. You stand right there and you hold your position. That's what you're doing when you keep Shabbat. And in order to do that, of course, he says, you're going to have to keep your little foot from going where it would prefer to go on Shabbat. You hold your place. Just imagine if it helps, because this is the way it feels pretty often. You know that you've been called back and that you are part of the walls, just like it says in Jerusalem, the precious stones that make up the gates and the walls, that's us. We are the precious stones. And so we've been called out of darkness into his marvelous light. Now he implants us in that wall again, where there was an empty space. Now we come back and we take our place. We stand there in that place in the wall where there wasn't anyone before. So he's called us back to his Sabbaths, and we're standing there. But that doesn't mean that the foxes and the little foxes and all manner of predators aren't going to, how does he put it, like a lion roaming to and fro, that they're not going to pace to and fro, just like they did when they rebuilt the second temple. Remember how the Arabs and other people groups, they were coming up to the wall, just taunting them, insulting them. We're going to go tell the king on you, you know, look, talk about little informants. That's what these people were, but they were taunting. They were doing anything that would lure the repairers of the wall away from the wall to get them to leave their station. And so the adversary knows what pulls your chain, so to speak. He knows how to push your buttons. He knows what it takes to lure you away from your place in the wall. He's an observer. Remember, he's a fox. He collects information. He collects data. He has you under surveillance. So he knows what your weak point is. He's not going to attack you at a strong point. He's going to try to lure you away with something that appeals to you. And if he can lure you away, then now he's got an empty place in the wall again. And that's why Shabbat is so important. When we stand fast on Shabbat, then it's very difficult for him to get in and to spoil the vineyard, because as Yeshua, as the footsteps of Messiah approach, more and more people are being called and raised up to restore these holes in the wall and to repair the walls, to build up the walls, to make them high enough that the foxes and all these other creatures can't get in. And so that's why Shabbat should be the place where our feet hold fast. It's where you will go on Shabbat. That seems to be the trouble, because he says, if you will keep your feet from doing your own pleasure, basically, from going in the direction. And often I think it's not because of our own pleasure, it's because we are lured at the pleasure of other people. So that's the importance of the Veshamru, watching over the Shabbat. And of course, the Kiddush cup that you drink on Shabbat, you're drinking the fruit of the vine, which reminds you of your responsibility to Shabbat to keep watch over the vineyard. As you're drinking the Kiddush cup, that very act is the act of a watch person. That very act is the act of a repairer of the breach, of a builder of the wall. You take that sip, just a sip of that fruit of the vine on Shabbat, and you say, my feet hold firm right here. I'm not moving. I am not allowing any more foxes into this vineyard. The bride of Messiah deserves my protection. It deserves my intercession. And that was the lament in the scripture we read last night, that no matter where he looked, there was nobody who could uphold him. There was nobody who could uphold his righteousness. So he sent his own arm. And so we are leaning on that arm, which is Yeshua. And we referred back to, again, from last week, Micah 7:7, because after all the troubles and the tribulations that are expected in Micah that accompany the footsteps of Messiah, his conclusion was, as for me, I will watch expectantly for the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me. So as you're seeing all these troubles, Micah is saying, that's when you need to perk up. And even more, watch expectantly for Yeshua to come. Even more, say that the God of my salvation is coming and he is going to hear my prayers. Just because I know tribulation is coming, I'm not going to despair and say there's nothing I can do about it. You can do something about it, which is the nature of an intercessor. An intercessor will pray hopeless prayers. Moses prayed a hopeless prayer over the Israelites and they were saved. So don't assume the world is hopeless. Like I say, it's until the lightning goes from the east to the west, do not give up. One commentary said to this particular passage, and of course the rabbis are associating this with the footsteps of Messiah, like your salvation is nearer than ever in the tribulation. They say the intent of the verse is Babylonia and Rome. In other words, the head of the beast and the legs and the feet of the beast. The whole beast, in other words. Babylonia and Rome, do not rejoice over me. For though I have fallen into exile, I will yet rise. No matter how bad it looks in Babylon, no matter how vicious the red beast looks, they're saying this exile is not forever. This exile is the place from which we will rise. So all the more we wait expectantly to hear the good news of Yeshua, to hear him proclaim the feasts. And so knowing what we know about the Jewish mindset, we can look in the book of Revelation, which addresses both Babylon the Great, and Rome, which is the red beast. John is tying those two things together. that explains why the number 7 permeates the book of Revelation. It is a restoration of Shabbat, looking back at last night's lesson, how, it's all about Shabbat. If we want to be, raised up to be helpers of the Holy One, if he's going to allow us to help him, and then he says, this is how, keep the Shabbat, then we can see how Revelation is an encouragement to those who want to be raised up, who want to rebuild the wall, who want to stand in the gap. They're being called to restore Shabbat in the world, because that Shabbat is going to be a light to the whole world. As there are 2 little candles in your house on Erev Shabbat, what we are doing by restoring the feasts among our communities, not just our homes, but our communities, is we are also in turn creating lights in the world. Those little lights in your house, like you said, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. You let people know that's what you're doing. When they invite you to go do this or that or the other, and you say, well, no, we do a Shabbat at our house on Friday night. That's your opportunity to let those 2 little candles in your house shine into the world, because you are proclaiming one Elohim. There is one Elohim throughout the creation, and we're not him. So we are restoring his Shabbat to proclaim that he is the only Elohim throughout the creation. So again, it's who knew that the simple precept of Shabbat from the creation week, the simple precept of Shabbat from the 10 Commandments in the prophets has grown into this huge thing from Genesis to Revelation, that our steps toward restoration and also being called a restorer of the breach, when for so long there was nobody who could put Yeshua and the Torah together. And now there is a generation who can put those 2 things together. If they will not faint, and if they will not allow their feet to be moved from these places of restoration where they have been planted, they can't run to and fro anymore. That's the characteristic of Ephraim. Ephraim is like a silly dove, it says, that just flits, and flops everywhere. We can't be that anymore. We have to set our feet firmly in those breaches in the wall so that we can become that wall. All right, so again, the text we're working with from the song is "My beloved is mine and I am his." It's reminding us of that exclusive relationship that we enjoy, with the Shema, with the first commandment. And so Israel is being called forth as a people and a nation to a unique relationship. If they will accept that unique relationship of my beloved is mine and I am his, then they in turn can become those helpers. Abba allows you to help him repair the drywall. So we get to help Abba. We get to be his helpers in proclaiming the light of his word to the peoples and the nations of the earth. And as believers in Messiah Yeshua, we see more than just the Torah is a light. The Torah is a light. That's a given. That's never had a beginning or an end. It's forever. The Torah is a light. The commandment is a lamp. But not all peoples have seen Yeshua as that living word, as the word made flesh. They have not seen him as a light to the peoples. And by the same token, many peoples who accept Yeshua as the light reject the Torah as the light. You can see why it was so hard for the Holy One to find someone who would stand in the gap and intercede. And so this gives us a great reason, again, to kindle the Shabbat lights. Whether you kindle 2 lights or whether you're also kindling extra lights for your children doesn't really matter. What really matters is you kindle those Shabbat lights as a reminder to yourself that you have been called out of other peoples. You have been called out of other nations in order to proclaim the light of the Torah and Yeshua to the peoples and the nations of the earth. Those little lights in your house are not just decorative, just like they can remind you of the two cherubim that guarded the way back, and the fiery sword that guarded the way back to the Garden of Eden and resurrection. Those candles can remind you that you will be resurrected and you will be able to pass through the fiery sword. In the same way, those two lights remind you to proclaim that light to the peoples and the nations. The Midrash kind of it defines my beloved as mine and I am his. It says he is mine as my God and I am his. In other words, there is none other. And they refer to Exodus 20 verse 2, where he says, I am Yod He Vav He, your God. And they clarify that, and they say, I am his as a people and as his nation. Why does that matter? Well, in Isaiah 51:4, remember, we are called to be a light to the peoples and the nations. Isaiah 51:4 says, pay attention to me, my people. Give ear to me, my nation. For instruction, the Torah, will come forth from me, and my judgment, my mishpat, will be a light for the peoples. This is the importance of recognizing your unique relationship with your beloved. The beloved are called, just like Yeshua was called to be the mediator between mankind and Elohim. We are also these mediators. We are the messengers. We are the go-betweens. If they don't observe us as a people of light, if they don't observe us as a nation of light, then it's going to be very difficult for them to hear the light, the instruction of the Torah that comes forth from him. It's going to be very difficult for them to accept his judgments, which are also a light. They see them as a yoke, as oppression, as too heavy, as impossible. And we are right now the only witnesses in the earth that are capable of telling them it's not a heavy yoke. It's not too hard. It's not impossible. The word is near you. It's even in your heart, right? It's in your mouth and in your heart. The world is sending a different message than this right here. Don't pay attention. Discard. Overlook. And we are saying pay attention to the Torah. Pay attention to the light. Pay attention to the instruction. Pay attention to the judgments that are in that Torah. Because if you can accept them, like Yeshua said, then you can accept him. Those two things will eventually go together. And this is why at least 7 times in Revelation is the phrase, he who has an ear, let him hear. It goes back to this phrase right here in Isaiah 51:4. Listen to me, my people. Give ear to me, my nation. It reminds us, if we see all these 7s in Revelation, and then we see 7 times, he who has an ear, let him hear, it should call to our remembrance what Isaiah 51:4 is saying. Give ear to me. If you will give ear to me, then you are my people and my nation. That's who you are. That's your identity. And now you have to shine. You have to be that intercessor, that builder, that one who stands in the gap. Okay, now as a review, there's 3 relationships we've looked at in chapter 2. Father to child, shepherd to flock, and watchman to vineyard. In fact, we spent most of our time up to this point looking at the relationship of the watchman to the vineyard, because Elohim is the ultimate watchman over his vineyard, but then he also sets us as watchmen over his vineyard. That's important, because if not, then we'll walk off our posts. Shabbat is our duty. It is our duty. There's a prayer called the Elena, It is incumbent upon us. We are obligated to. It is our duty to obey the master of all and to maintain our place in the wall of Shabbat to protect the vineyard. So we're going to look at these other two relationships. Let's see if we can work this in before we move on to the next verse in the song. Isaiah 63:16. Again, establishing the relationship of father and child. It says, for you are our father, though Abraham does not know us and Israel does not recognize us. You, O Lord, are our father. So that implies in prophecy that there will be a people who acknowledge Adonai as their father, even though Abraham wouldn't know them and Israel would not recognize them. But nevertheless, they have attached to the Father. They have lost their identity in some way. They're going to be difficult to recognize because they've been far off, because they've been in exile, because they've been among the peoples. And now they're like Joseph. They don't look like Father Abraham. They don't look like Israelites with an Israelite definite identity as community. But this describes, as we look at Jeremiah 31:9, it's going to pull in the father-child relationship and then link it to the shepherd and the flock. And I think it helps explain Isaiah 63:16. Why would Abraham have children he didn't recognize? Why would Israelites with a definite Israelite identity not recognize us, even though we have the same father? He says, with weeping they will come, and by supplication I will lead them. I will make them walk by streams of water on a straight path in which they will not stumble. For I am a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations. Remember the peoples and nations? Hear the word of the Lord, O nations. And declare in the coastlands afar off and say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. So linking the father and son in this verse in Jeremiah 31, and then the reference goes on into the shepherd and the flock. Well, we understand sheep being scattered. So when he says, I'm going to gather, these sheep have been scattered and I'm going to gather them in, he's linking that idea to that of father and child. That even though this child has been scattered like scattered sheep, he will regather them. Even though Abraham and Israel doesn't recognize us today, they will. They will. And how will we be able to, how will they recognize us? How will they understand that he also is our father and that Abraham also is our father? It doesn't say we march in nonchalantly, dictating the rules and the halakha. Instead, it says with weeping, they will come. And by supplication, I will lead them. This is a humbled heart. They didn't go out into the exile to become more arrogant. Instead, it says with weeping, they will come and by supplication. And so he will lead them when we weep and when we pray to him, when we supplicate, because we understand how far we have wandered. And we are so grateful that he is our father and that we also have an identity as children of Abraham and as Israel, even though they don't recognize us. We recognize the implication, I think, in Isaiah 63:16 is we recognize who we are before Abraham and Israel. The Father knows who we are. He never lost us. He scattered us, but he never lost us. He always knew who we were and where we were. And that's how he knows where to find us. And so there might be other children of Abraham who have that identity as Israel, who haven't yet recognized this. And maybe they're beginning to. I think they are. more of this relationship. And again, we're going to link it back to the shepherd and sheep. Exodus 4:22. It says, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. And Deuteronomy 14:1, that says, you are the sons of the Lord your God. You shall not cut yourselves, nor shave your forehead for the sake of the dead. So this adds something in terms of being children of Abraham. Of course, we know what was shown to Abraham was the resurrection from the dead. This is the promise of the fathers, that his children could inherit the land, not just the physical land, that they could also inherit their inheritance in the Garden of Eden. They could return to the Garden of Eden. And so as children of Israel, as children of Abraham, as the sons of Adonai, who is life itself, he says, don't do things like these death rituals. We're down here close to New Orleans right now. And of course, if you watch the news, you see pictures of them getting ready for Mardi Gras. And it's like a death cult. He's saying, don't do that. Don't have any association with these death cults. Don't shave your forehead for the dead. Don't cut yourselves. Don't put in memoriam of whoever and a tattoo on yourself. Don't do that, because you're identifying yourself with the realm of the dead, when the children of the Father of life, their job, their obligation is to link themselves with life and resurrection. So he says, don't ever link yourselves with the realm of the dead. Your promise is the promise of the fathers. You can see again why it would be very difficult to be recognized if you have all these death trappings in your skin or in what you're wearing and so forth, what you're celebrating. You can see why Abraham wouldn't know you. You can see why a Jewish person wouldn't recognize you as a fellow child, as a brother or sister, because what you're wearing or what you're doing in your flesh is telling them just the opposite. I'm linked to the realm of the dead, when the children of Abraham are linked to the realm of life. The promise of the fathers is to inherit a land that is inhabitable. It says long days. Sometimes when you'll see those prophecies like honor your father and mother, and it will prolong your days. The prolonged days are seen to be prophetically associated with the Garden of Eden. And it's only obtainable through resurrection from the dead. It's only obtainable through Yeshua, life from the dead. And so after the death and resurrection of Yeshua, then the sons of Israel should be the first fruits of life from death, because he keeps reiterating, my firstborn, Ephraim is my firstborn, Israel is my firstborn. We are the first fruits of life from death, now that Yeshua has died and been resurrected. And this is especially why we don't want to identify with skulls and all that death cult stuff that's out there. Okay, so Deuteronomy 1:31, I'm trying to get it where I can read it. There we go. It says, and in the wilderness, where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carries his son, and all the way which you have walked until you came to this place. So many times we wonder if the Holy One is truly carrying us, especially as the tribulations get worse. Ironically, I think I have felt more since our troubles set in a few years ago. I think I have felt the sense of being carried more since the plague hit than before. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's just me. I don't know if that's happening to you too, but it just seems as the footsteps get nearer, the more I have an awareness that I'm being carried, not in a way that I don't want to go. I am being carried in a way that I want to go. It's just that I don't have the ability to go there by myself under my own strength. And he says, this is what I promise you, I'm your Abba. And you are my child. And an Abba knows when his child can't walk on his own or her own. And so you may not realize it. And I don't know that the Israelites in the cloud in the wilderness understood exactly how they were being moved. But at the end of the day, their sandals didn't wear out. How about that? So we might find out at the end of this that he has carried us and we didn't really perceive exactly what was happening. But when we get to the end, we'll look back and say, I could have never walked that journey through the wilderness by myself. He must have carried me all the way. Because our ultimate destination is the garden. Our ultimate destination is the resurrection. He is trying to bring us to that place if we won't be distracted. Psalm 80, verse 1. Oh, give ear, shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock. Right? So we've established that there's a father-son or a father-child relationship. He linked it to the shepherd and flock relationship. And so this one, which links Israel to its shepherd, there's an interesting turn of phrase here. It's usually Israel who is being told to give heed, to give ear, to listen. And now see how it's flipped. There's a reciprocation. It goes back to I am my beloved's and he is mine. That unique, exclusive relationship between Israel and Elohim. And so it's usually us. We need to listen. We need to give ear. But now the cry is, oh, shepherd of Israel, give ear, listen to us. Reciprocate. Let us enter into this relationship of beloved. Israel and their shepherd, they're crying out for a new relationship. And in this case, it's not him telling us to give ear. We're asking him, please listen. Because he gave us the greatest commandment, Shema Yisrael. He gave us the Song of Moses, which starts with Ha'azinu, give ear. And so now we are saying, we're doing our best to Shema. We're doing our best to Ha'azinu. We're doing our best to be cooperative sheep and quit bouncing and flouncing over the hills and the mountains and under every green tree. So please give ear to our cries. We're tired of our exile. And so usually, I would say 100% of the time, usually 100% of the time, the Holy One is going to ask for what he has already supplied. If he asks something from you, it's because he's already given it to you. And so in this case, Israel is seeking what he has already provided to them in history. He has demonstrated in history, he has the willingness to give ear to Israel when they cry out. He gave ear to them and responded to them when they cried out in Egypt. In fact, they cry out and he's like, okay, Moses is already born. I've already made plans for Moses. Even Pharaoh's magicians know about it. I'm going to supply what you're crying out for. At the Reed Sea, Moses says, stand still and see the Yeshuat Adonai. He had already provided Yeshua. He had already provided the word. He had already provided salvation before they even cried out. He had made the way in the sea. It just hadn't opened up yet. And the sages point out, oddly, in this list of historical times when Israel cries out only to the shepherd of Israel, only to the Holy One, they point out Judges 4:3. And remember, this is the story of Sisera, and I think he had 900 iron chariots. And it's Deborah who responds, the judge Deborah. And she goes up, and with Barak, she makes war against Sisera and his iron chariots, which makes you think of Rome, by the way, because of the metal. Iron is associated with the kingdom, the beast kingdom of Rome. I think there's some prophecy here if we seek it and read it a little more carefully. There's probably some really big hints in the Song of Deborah. But they're enduring this harsh treatment under Sisera, and it's in their own land. In Egypt, they're not in their own land. At the Reed Sea, they're not in their own land. But with Sisera, the sages say they were in their own land and they were still being oppressed. They were still enduring harsh treatment that caused them to cry out under Pharaoh. And therefore, when they cried out, the shepherd of Israel responded to them. He had already supplied what they needed in the judge Deborah. She's already judging Israel at this time, and he raises her up. So that my beloved is mine and I am his. Again, that's the reciprocal relationship. It takes us back to the Exodus from Egypt. And excuse me. What that is, but it tastes good. The illustration here is that Adonai had destroyed the gods of Egypt in the plagues. And the final plague, of course, we remember, was the slaying of the firstborn sons. So that established all the other firstborn sons could die, but the father, the shepherd, the watchman of Israel, he was going to preserve Israel's firstborn sons. He says, but I want you to help me out here. I'm going to preserve your firstborn, but I'm going to let you help me. And here's how I want you to help. I want you to slay a lamb. And he gave them the specifications, the day they were supposed to do it, on the 10th day of the month. This is the type of lamb you're supposed to take. This is what you do with it. And then you're going to have to slaughter that lamb in order to preserve your firstborn sons. So it wasn't like they did absolutely nothing. He allowed them to become partners in their own salvation. Just like if somebody presents the salvation message to an unbeliever, it's not like they stand there and do nothing. They have to help themselves. They have to believe, and they have to respond, and they have to confess their belief. They have to make a public proclamation of their belief. And so even though the forgiveness is there, the salvation is there, and they couldn't do anything for that, they must help. They must respond. And so in this particular instance, by slaying the lambs, the Israelites were allowed to help in preserving the firstborn sons. But at the very same time, and you can see now why he's linking the father-son relationship with the shepherd flock relationship, because when they slay the lambs, they preserve the firstborn sons. But also in slaying the lambs, at the very same time, they are helping to slaughter the deity of Egypt. There's one left. In all the plagues, he's destroying their gods, which are really not gods at all. But this final one, and Moses even points this out in Exodus 8:22, he says, behold, if we were to slaughter the deity of Egypt in their sight, will they not stone us? And nobody disagrees with this statement, that if they were to slaughter the lambs on that scale, that they would be slaughtering the deity of Egypt. There was, and possibly is, I don't know if it's still in Egypt, but there was a deity of Egypt. There was a stronghold, there was a god of Egypt. And in order to destroy this stronghold of this deity, what had to be done was the slaughter of the lamb. Now, the Egyptians, Moses is saying, they're not going to just let this slip by them. They're going to stone us if we slaughter their deity. Which my question is, like, if your deity can be slaughtered, then is he really worth worshiping? Nobody ever really thinks of that when they have idols, right? I mean, if you make your own idol and your idol can be destroyed, then what was the point to begin with? That's kind of goes back to the story of Abraham smashing all his father's idols. And then when his father came back, he's like, what happened? And Abraham had left the hammer in one of the idol's hands. And he says, well, that one did it to the other ones. It's like, that's impossible. And he says, well, then why are you making them? If they don't have any power, then why make an idol? And it goes with making an idol of ourselves. If ultimately we don't have the power to save ourselves, then why do we insist on running our lives our way and doing our own pleasure, especially on Shabbat? Shabbat's kind of the litmus test of idolatry. If you will do his will on Shabbat, then you're not the deity. But if you obey his word, you will slaughter any shred of idolatry left in your life. But not everybody's ready to give up those idols. And Moses points out they're going to stone us if we slaughter these lambs. So let's go back again to why we keep linking the feasts with the footsteps of Messiah. Remember, it's Nahum 1:15. Behold, on the mountains, the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace. Celebrate your feasts, O Judah. Pay your vows. This is when you paid vows at the 3 pilgrimage feasts, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. He says, never again will the wicked one pass through you. He is cut off completely. Now does it make sense how slaying the lamb and observing the Pesach is going to destroy their deity? This is what the feasts do. They destroy idols. They destroy the adversary. It cuts them off. You can see why the king of Babylon in Isaiah wanted to set his throne on the Mount of the Moed to prevent the nations and the peoples from observing the feasts of Adonai. Because should they all turn and begin to observe his Sabbaths and begin to observe the feasts of Adonai, he would be cut off completely. So it's a little interesting that the sages said that Micah's prophecy concerned Babylon and Rome, that even though we're in exile, we're not staying there. He's going to lift us up. What is he going to lift us up to do? To celebrate the feasts. When we hear footsteps coming on the mountains, a people will be raised up who will celebrate the feasts and the Sabbaths. And when they begin to do that, the wicked one knows his time is short. He's about to be cut off. Now they're about to take their place in the breaches in the wall. They're about to let their light shine. They're about to start rebuilding the walls, and they're about to be the wall. The vineyard is going to be protected once again. And like we've said, this long negotiation with Pharaoh, it concerned Moses' request for the Hebrews to go out and celebrate a Chag to Adonai in the wilderness, because both Pharaoh and Moses know that the feasts are the key to breaking the power of the adversary. And so again, if I know some of you don't join us on the live stream on Shabbat because you've already heard it, but sometimes I add stuff in there. And on Shabbat, I added some things about the waterways, because remember the thing in Egypt was they could control the irrigation, the waterways, with their feet. That was something that the Israelites looked back to and longed for the days that the waterways could be controlled with the feet. That's something they learned in Egypt. That means that if you can return to that system, then you will actually obstruct the type of worship that is established in the word. And so this explains to an extent why these commercial, not just waterways, but commercial transportation systems are going to have to be disrupted. The footsteps of Messiah will destroy these systems, because the control over commerce is based on controlling the commercial routes, whether it's in the waterways, whether it's commercial trucking, whether it's the railways. When it says a third of the ships were destroyed, it may not be just ships, because the ships do represent commercial transportation. And the commercial transportation, to a large extent, is what has transferred and introduced idolatry around the world. What was foreign to you in ways your fathers did not know has been introduced. And more you were seeing very ancient idolatry reintroduced into the Western world that thought it had shed that, but apparently it's back around. What's happening? Well, see, the adversary knows his time is short because he can look around and see these unknown children of Abraham and Israel rising up, being raised up to celebrate the feasts. He knows he's about to be cut off. But this idea that the feasts are so important as part of the good news. See, when we proclaim the feast, we should be preaching the message of Messiah, salvation, redemption, sanctification. Everything you need to know about Messiah is contained in the feasts. Death, resurrection, repentance, all of that is proclaimed in the feasts. So the feasts have to be included in this good news, in the footsteps of Messiah. No longer will the good news be proclaimed apart from the feasts. That seems to be the prophecy. Because if we observe the feasts with a humble heart, we do more than just cut off the wicked one. We are actually helping. Remember our exclusive relationship? We call on him for help, and now he calls on us. Now we are helping him to destroy the idols, just like slaying the lamb destroyed the deity of Egypt. When you keep the feast, you are destroying idols. They may not look like idols because, like I say, in the Western world, it's much more subtle. It doesn't matter whether you can see that idol like a little statue or not. They're around more than ever before. But when you keep the feast, you destroy the deity of Egypt. You destroy the crocodile of the Nile. You destroy the serpent. You destroy his beast kingdoms when you keep the feasts. When that good news includes the feasts, then we have the power to cut off the wicked one. So the right to kill the lamb, if it's so important to kill the lamb, if Yeshua's death, if keeping the feast of Pesach is so powerful, it can slay the deities of the world, then we need to look at the prescription. How does he say to do it? How does this work? Exodus 12:3, it says, speak to all the congregation of Israel, no other congregation. Speak to all the congregation of Israel. You need that identity. Saying, on the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their fathers' households, a lamb for each household. All right, so I went ahead and I put the Hebrew in there for those of you who can read it, but I wanted you to note the wording that has to do with the father's households. Lahem ish seh, to them, a man, lamb, right? Lebet avot, seh lebait. In other words, it's not just saying a lamb for a household, because you could get up to, I think, around 50 people on a lamb in terms of registering for a lamb to share, because you're only going to eat as much, you're only required to eat as much as the size of an olive. So the point is not eating as much lamb that night as your stomach can possibly hold. That's not the deal. The deal is to taste, have a full bite, at least one full bite of the lamb, because you're sharing in it. You're sharing in that covenant. The emphasis here is on who is going to take the lamb and who is going to slay the lamb. And so their avot, lebet avot, to the house of the fathers, to the house of the fathers, avot. Avot is the key word. We have to look back to the fathers to understand the slaughter of the lamb. So you couldn't just take any old lamb. You couldn't go into the flocks of Egypt and select a lamb. It would not be qualified for the Pesach offering. It couldn't be a person from any other nation. If we want to say, okay, how does this relate to Yeshua? Yeshua couldn't have been from just any nation. Yeshua could only be from one nation and one people because of that unique relationship that's prophesied in the Song of Songs, that's prophesied in Exodus. The Pesach offering has to reflect that uniqueness. My beloved is mine and I am his, none other. Israel has a unique obligation. Again, go back and check the Aleinu in your Siddur if you have one. It is incumbent upon us. It is Israel's unique obligation to preserve the Pesach offering through the ages. No other nation, no other people. And I think this is why Nahum 1:15, where it says, keep your feasts, it doesn't say, oh, Israel, because I think the prophet knows Israel's going to lose its identity and they're going to lose their hold on the feasts. So he assigns it to the one tribe, which there's other tribes within Judah. We know that because they maintain their tribal identities in history, at least up to a certain point. Not all of the 10 tribes are lost. Some of them went south when the roads opened up. They went south and again returned so that they could worship in Jerusalem. But the majority, they were lost. They would lose their hold. So he assigns the hold to Judah. Keep your feast to Judah, not because Judah is the only tribe that is required to keep the feast, but it tells us that Judah is going to be the one tribe that never loses sight or loses its grasp on the Pesach offering and everything that goes with it. And the lamb is going to come from the tribe of Judah. If Judah doesn't keep his feast, if Judah doesn't kill its lamb, Yeshua, then we have no salvation. Judah has to kill the lamb. There's no question right here. Keep your feast, O Judah. It must be Judah. They are obligated. They cannot take their sacrifice from any other nation. They can't take their sacrifice from any other tribe, even within the nation and the people. They must take this lamb. If they are going to destroy the deity of Egypt, if they are going to destroy the idols of the world, then it has to be Judah that takes that initiative. It has to be their own lamb. It cannot be another. So it's defining here the bloodline of the lamb, as well as those who are qualified to slaughter it. If you violate these rules, again, going back to how Moses tells them, it has to be from your own household, and it has to be according to the fathers. And in other words, according to your tribes. Not just Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but going back to the fathers of your tribes, going back in your bloodline. If you're from the tribe of Asher, then take a lamb from the tribe of Asher. If you're from the tribe of Judah, then take a lamb from the tribe of Judah, because this is going to preserve the prophecy through the ages. And so if they did not accept and perform these requirements of slaying the lamb, then how would the nations ever be redeemed? How would the nations and the peoples ever be incorporated into the blood covenant? It had to start with Israel. And this great obligation of a particular lamb fell upon Judah. And when we see that, it absolutely defies any replacement theology that says because the Jews killed Jesus, which they didn't really, Rome crucified him, and he gave up his own life. But again, they had to bring this lamb. Judah had to bring this lamb in order to destroy the deities, the idols of the world. Judah did exactly what it was required to do: perhaps for the wrong reasons, but they did what they were obligated to do. So if we take that plain language of Moses' instructions about the lamb, he's saying the lamb has to come from an Israelite's own household, their own kin. It has to be owned by an Israelite. And the one whose hand slaughters the lamb must also be of the household of the Avot, or the fathers. Ultimately, going back from the 12 tribes from Jacob, you're tracing it back all the way from Jacob to Isaac to Abraham, because remember they said Abraham doesn't recognize us. And so, again, going back to the liturgy, we looked at the Vishamru last night. If you do the daily prayers, if you do the Shmoneh Esrei, which is the 18 benedictions of the daily prayers done 3 times daily by Orthodox Jews, the first prayer of the Shmoneh Esrei, and by the way, I'm not sure if you know this, just a little bit of trivia that has nothing to do with anything, I guess, but when you look at the Shmoneh Esrei and the way that there's 3 portions of it that kind of accomplish 3 things, gratitude, supplications for difficulties, and then, well, I would say more like praise and worship as you go into it. But as you get to the end, again, you get to the gratitude. And those are thought to align themselves with the 3 calls of the shofar. That you can actually break the Shmoneh Esrei into 3 sections, and it will correspond to the shofar calls on the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the Resurrection Day, which is pretty cool. But at least the first 2 prayers, the Magen Avot and the Gibor, which is power, strength, resurrection power, those 2 prayers are both about the resurrection. The first one is called the Magen Avot, or the Shield of Abraham. And again, it's a resurrection prayer, and it alludes to the promise given to Abraham. And if you know what the promise given to Abraham is, as it pertains to the land of Israel, not just the physical land, but get up, Abraham, get up to where? Get up to the Garden of Eden and see the inheritance of your children. I want to show you that. I want you to walk this land. I want you to claim it for your children. I want you to see that I'm going to protect them from death. I'm going to give them eternal life, and they're going to be able to inherit the land of Israel above. They are going to be resurrected, Abraham. That's why having the Magen Avot first, like, what is the shield of Abraham? Probably lots of answers if you look into the sages' commentaries, but one shield of Abraham, of course, is going to be protection from death. The protection of the fathers, again, is the promise to the fathers that their children will be protected from eternal death. Their experience in death will not be the same as those who reject the Lamb. Okay, how am I doing on time? Oops, went over a little bit. We'll keep going. All right. Last night, I demonstrated how you can sing the Veshamru on Shabbat if you want to. This is the Magen Avot. It's part of the daily prayers. It's also part of the Shabbat prayers. The Shabbat prayers are more concise. You don't ask for everything under the sun on Shabbat, but you still remain in an attitude of praise and gratitude. And so the Avot, or the fathers, again, they're part of the Amidah on Shabbat. And so, of course, as the first prayer, you would, you're going to take 3 steps back, traditionally. Get yourself centered, get yourself in the right attitude of prayer, remind yourself before whom you stand, and then you take 3 steps forward into the presence, figuratively speaking. You're going to bow when you say Baruch Atah, or blessed are you in English, and then you'll straighten back up. Adonai our God, and the God of our fathers, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, and God of Jacob, the great, mighty, and awe-inspiring God, the Most High God, who bestows kindness and creates all, who remembers the kindnesses of the fathers. See how it's connecting what he promised to the fathers with us, that we want him to remember that promise of resurrection and inheritance in the land, and who brings a redeemer to their children's children for the sake of his name with love, O King, helper, savior, and shield. Okay, helper, he's the helper. And now he's calling us to help him. But the promise here, he's going to bring a redeemer. Why do we need a redeemer? Because right now, we are mortal people. We are going to die. We need someone who can redeem us from our sins so that we can resurrect and take that inheritance that he has assigned us in the garden. And this redeemer, it says, even comes to their children's children. Remember Abraham? He doesn't recognize these children. Like, where did these come from? Abraham doesn't recognize us. Israel doesn't recognize us. Doesn't matter. Adonai knows who they are and where they are. And so they're saying, we want you to be our king. We want you to be our helper, our savior, our shield, all these things that are discussed in the prophets concerning the footsteps of Messiah. And then with this particular benediction, when you say, blessed are you again, you would bow. And then you would straighten back up after you say you, Adonai, shield of Abraham. So I hope that helps clarify why the Lamb has to come from the house of the fathers. It can't come from another nation. It has to come from Israel. It has to come from your father's house. And this goes back to the Father never asks us for something he hasn't already supplied. If you want to say it in Hebrew, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. You're used to saying that with the Shema, right? So you kind of already have these words rolling in your head if you're not used to saying it. So you say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, ve'Elohei Yaakov, Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor ve'Hanora El Elyon, Gomer Chasadim Tovim, ve'Konei Hakol, ve'Zocher Chazdei Avot, u'Mevi Goel Livnei V'neihem Leman Shemo Ba'ahava, Melech, Ozer, u'Moshia u'Magen, Baruch atah Adonai, Magen Abraham. Right, where it says 2 times there, I do that when we're singing it, because there's a particular tune, and you repeat those last 2 lines when you're singing the tune. So kind of to reiterate, since I'm running over now, like we said, he's not going to seek from your hand. If you're in covenant with him, he will never seek from your hand something that he hasn't already provided. Keep that in mind when we say we're his helpers. He allows us to help him with the things he has already given us. And what is our choice is our free will, whether we choose to take those things he's already given us and offer them back to him. Just like Yeshua, we might seek his salvation, but what we'll find is that it's already been handed down to us. The ability to ask for salvation in Yeshua, it was already handed to us through the promise of the fathers. We already have the light of the Torah that promised this lamb. He's already put it in our hands. Where to find this lamb to give back to him? He gave us faith. Remember the man who cried out to Yeshua and said, help my unbelief? And he was helped. And so if we have faith, it's because he's given it to us. If we have a lamb, it's because he's given it to us from the house of our fathers. But it was vital that the Jews kill the lamb, even though legally, yes, Rome crucified him, Rome. And you have the Jews calling for his death, but you can tell that there's an awareness there. If this is the lamb, Let his blood be upon our heads and upon the heads of our children. It's by their hand that this lamb has to die. That's their obligation. The nations, the peoples, cannot be saved and brought into covenant unless the Jews kill the lamb. And I think this accounts for at least some of these cries, let his blood be upon our heads and upon the heads of our children. If they don't say that, then where is the fulfillment of the commandment? But in the long run, they don't really kill him. They want his blood. They're putting their hand to the slaughter. They've taken the lamb, but ultimately, because of the power of who Yeshua was, he slaughtered himself. He was from the Father's house. He was the lamb from the Father's house. And he could have taken his life back at any time he wanted. But he says, no, nobody takes my life from me. I lay it down. And he chose when he would give up the ghost. He was the Jew from the house of Judah, from the people in the nation Israel, who made that sacrifice to destroy the idolatry of the nations and the peoples, to bring them to salvation. Nobody could kill him. He had already shown us nobody could kill him. If the crowd got mad at him, he'd just disappear. He'd just walk through him. Nothing. Nobody could kill him if he didn't kill himself, so to speak. He put his own hand to his own slaughter. He was that lamb from the household of the Avot. It didn't go outside the household. I am my beloved's, and he is mine. It kept it within the family, because only if you kept it within the family could the nations and the peoples share in the slaughter. Eventually, it would open the door for them to also take hold of that blood covenant. And so this principle of my beloved is mine, I am his, that just reiterates that the Father in heaven, the Avot, the fathers of our faith, and their children Israel, they are born from the Avot. They are born from the fathers, whether they're natural born or, again, whether they've been grafted in. The epistles of Paul remind us that we are still children of Abraham. The shepherd, the sheep, the lamb, Yeshua, they're born from the sheep, Israel. You see how Yeshua came from the fathers. Yeshua came from the sheep as well. He was their lamb. Father, shepherd, and then how about watchman? Well, remember, we have that great watchman, the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps. He's the watchman on the wall. He's the one who watches over his vineyard. And what is he doing? He is now raising up repairers of the breach. And he's doing it with his own right arm, Yeshua. And Yeshua was born from the people and the nation of watchmen. So you see how it all circles together? This unique relationship, father, shepherd, watchman. We have that heritage. And it should make us feel wonderful that we have that connection. That we're not just these disembodied people out here wandering around. It feels like it sometimes because remember, Abraham doesn't recognize them and Israel doesn't recognize them. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, for the most part, don't recognize who we are yet. And that was prophesied. But you know what? You keep acting like a child of Abraham. You keep gathering like a sheep of Israel. And you start standing in the gap on the Shabbat and the feasts like a watchman. And they will start to recognize, because nobody's going to put up with that sort of abuse and persecution if it's not a family connection. In fact, I think it's in the last tractate of the Mishnah, the rabbis predict that in the last days, in the footsteps of Messiah, there will be Gentiles who put on tzitzit, who will build Sukkot. They'll start keeping the feasts and so forth. But when the tribulation really gets rough and tough, they'll kick over their Sukkot, rip off their tzitzit, and they'll run away. So the Spirit is going to make a distinction between those who are just playing with Jewish play pretties or playing with replacement theologies and those who are truly part of the family. The Spirit can make that distinction, but you're going to show everyone when the tribulation really comes, if you keep standing in that place in the wall where he has planted your feet, and you will not run away from Shabbat, you will not run away from your feast, you will not run away from your Lamb, Yeshua, and deny his name, then you have told the world who you are, and Father Abraham will definitely recognize that. And I believe the Jewish people will definitely recognize that because you're serious. This is who I am. I can't be anybody else but who I am. So I guess we could stop there. We'll just go on with the Lord is my shepherd, I guess next week. Just explore that shepherd relationship a little bit more. Put a marker in there where I can remember. We didn't have much farther to go, but that'll be a good place that'll help us link it in next week.